Margaret O'Brien adjusted her pale blue dress for the 100th time, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she checked her reflection in the train station's grimy window. At 60 years old, she had never imagined she would be standing here, suitcase in hand, waiting for a man she had only known through letters and phone calls. The matrimonial agency had promised her a fresh start, a companion for her golden years, and Harold Whitman had seemed perfect on paper. A retired businessman from Phoenix, he had wooed her with promises of a comfortable life and genuine affection. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small depot platform, and Margaret felt perspiration beading on her forehead despite the early morning hour. She had traveled from her tiny apartment in Minneapolis, selling most of her possessions to afford the train ticket and the modest trousseau she had carefully selected. Her daughter Linda had been horrified when she learned of her mother's plans, calling her foolish and naive for trusting a stranger from a classified ad. But Margaret had felt something she hadn't experienced in the 15 years since her husband Robert died, hope. As the minutes ticked by, Margaret's optimism began to waver. Harold was supposed to meet her at 8:30, but it was now past 9. She approached the ticket counter where a bored-looking clerk barely glanced up from his newspaper. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm waiting for someone, Harold Whitman. He was supposed to pick me up." The clerk shrugged without looking up. "Lady, I see people waiting all the time. Sometimes they show, sometimes they don't. You might want to call him." Margaret's heart sank as she realized she didn't have a local phone number for Harold, only a post office box where she had sent her letters. Their few phone conversations had always been initiated by him, and she had never thought to ask for his home number. By 10 o'clock, the harsh reality began to settle in. Margaret sat on a hard wooden bench, her suitcase at her feet, watching other passengers come and go. A young mother with 2 small children gave her a sympathetic look, and an elderly man tipped his hat in her direction. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone in this strange place. The train that had brought her here was long gone, and she realized she didn't have enough money for a return ticket. Her mind raced as she tried to formulate a plan. She could call Linda, but the shame of admitting her daughter was right about Harold felt overwhelming. She could try to find a women's shelter, but the thought of explaining her situation to strangers made her stomach churn. Margaret had always been a proud woman, self-reliant and independent, but now she felt like a foolish old woman who had been taken advantage of by a man who probably never intended to meet her at all. The sun climbed higher, and Margaret's mouth grew dry. She had packed a small bottle of water and a sandwich, but her appetite had vanished along with her dreams of a new beginning. As she sat there, she noticed a tall man in worn jeans and a plaid shirt watching her from across the platform. He had kind eyes and salt and pepper hair beneath a well-worn cowboy hat. When their eyes met, he approached her with a gentle smile. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice you've been sitting here for quite a while," he said, his voice carrying a warm Texas drawl. "Are you waiting for someone? You look like you might need some help." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at his genuine concern. She had been so focused on her own humiliation that she hadn't expected kindness from a stranger. "I was supposed to meet someone," she managed to say, her voice cracking slightly, "but I don't think he's coming." The man's expression softened with understanding, and he settled onto the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "I own a ranch about 20 miles outside of town. I was here picking up some supplies that came in on the freight train." Margaret shook his hand, surprised by the calluses that spoke of honest work. "Margaret O'Brien," she replied. "I'm from Minneapolis." She found herself telling Jake about Harold, about the letters and promises, about selling her furniture and spending her savings on a dream that had turned into a nightmare. Jake listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making sympathetic sounds. "You know," Jake said after she finished her story, "I've got a spare room at my place if you need somewhere to stay while you figure things out. My daughter Emma lives with me, she's 16, and we could use some help around the house. I'm not trying to take advantage of your situation, ma'am. I just hate to see someone stranded like this." Margaret looked into his honest face and saw something she hadn't seen in Harold's letters, genuine decency. The decision to trust Jake Morrison would change everything for Margaret O'Brien. As she followed him to his dusty pickup truck, she had no idea that this moment of desperation would lead to something far more valuable than the comfortable retirement Harold had promised. Jake loaded her suitcase into the truck bed and held the passenger door open for her, a simple gesture that made her feel respected and valued. The ride to Morrison Ranch took them through stunning desert landscape that Margaret had never seen before. Jake pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area, his love for the land evident in every word. "I bought this place 15 years ago," he explained as they turned onto a dirt road. "It was pretty rundown then, but Emma and I have been fixing it up bit by bit. She's been the woman of the house since her mother died when she was 7. As they approached the ranch house, Margaret saw a modest but well-maintained home surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. A teenage girl with long brown hair emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. This was Emma, and Margaret could see Jake's kind eyes reflected in his daughter's face. "Dad, you're back early," Emma called out. "And you brought company." Jake made the introductions, explaining Margaret's situation with tactful brevity. Emma's reaction surprised Margaret. Instead of suspicion or resentment, the girl showed immediate compassion. "That's awful," she said, her young face creased with concern. "What kind of person does that to someone?" Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest at the girl's genuine indignation on her behalf. "Emma's been managing our household since she was 12, Jake said with obvious pride. "She's a better cook than I am and she keeps our books balanced, but I think she could use some help and maybe some female companionship." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I'd love that," she said. "I mean, if you want to stay, we don't get many visitors out here." Margaret found herself agreeing to stay for a few days while she sorted out her situation. Jake showed her to a comfortable guest room with a view of the desert mountains, and Emma immediately began planning meals and activities. For the first time since stepping off that train, Margaret felt like she might survive this ordeal with her dignity intact. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Margaret learned more about her hosts. Jake had been a construction foreman before inheriting the ranch from his uncle. Emma was homeschooled and helped with the ranch work, but she dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. They lived simply but contentedly, their bond strengthened by shared hardships and mutual respect. "I have to ask," Margaret said as they watched the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, "why would you take in a complete stranger like this? You don't know anything about me." Jake was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "My wife Sarah used to say that kindness is never wasted," he finally replied. "When she was dying, strangers helped us in ways I never expected. I guess I figure it's my turn to pay it forward." Margaret felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. She had expected to find a husband in Arizona, but instead she had found something much rarer, a family that accepted her without conditions or expectations. As she prepared for bed that night, she realized that Harold Whitman's betrayal might have been the best thing that ever happened to her. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing. She had slept better than she had in months, and for the first time in years, she felt needed. Emma was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for three, and Jake was feeding the animals. Margaret rolled up her sleeves and joined Emma, feeling useful and appreciated as they worked together. "Dad's been trying to handle everything himself since Mom died," Emma confided as they prepared pancakes. "He works too hard, and he never takes time for himself. I worry about him sometimes." Margaret recognized the weight of responsibility in the girl's voice and felt a kinship with her. They were both caretakers, both trying to hold their families together through difficult circumstances. Over breakfast, Jake mentioned that he needed to drive into town to file a report about Margaret's situation with the local sheriff. "Just in case this Harold character is running some kind of scam," he explained. "There might be other women he's done this to." Margaret hadn't considered that possibility, but it made sense. She agreed to accompany him, both to give her statement and to start the process of figuring out her next steps. At the sheriff's office, Deputy Martinez listened to Margaret's story with growing concern. "This sounds like a pattern we've been seeing," he said. "Men who prey on older women, especially those who are recently widowed or divorced. They get them to travel long distances, sometimes asking for money along the way, then disappear." Margaret felt sick to her stomach as she realized how close she had come to being victimized even further. "The good news," Deputy Martinez continued, "is that we've been building a case against several of these operations. Your testimony could help us shut them down." Margaret agreed to cooperate fully, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't expected. If her experience could prevent other women from going through the same humiliation, then perhaps some good could come from this situation. Jake waited patiently as Margaret gave her detailed statement, never once making her feel like a burden or an inconvenience. When they left the sheriff's office, he suggested they stop by the local diner for lunch. "Emma's been cooking for us for years," he said with a grin. "I think she deserves a break, don't you?" Margaret agreed, touched by his thoughtfulness toward his daughter. The diner was a classic small-town establishment, with worn vinyl booths and a menu that hadn't changed in decades. The waitress, a woman about Margaret's age named Betty, greeted Jake like an old friend. "Haven't seen you in town for a while," she said, then looked curiously at Margaret. Jake made introductions, explaining briefly that Margaret was staying at the ranch temporarily. Betty's expression immediately softened with sympathy and understanding. "Honey, I don't know what brought you to our little town," Betty said to Margaret, "but you landed in the right place. Jake Morrison is one of the good ones." Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest at the obvious affection and respect the community had for Jake. It was clear that he was well regarded, not just as a rancher, but as a person of integrity. As they drove back to the ranch, Margaret found herself studying Jake's profile. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way, but it was his character that impressed her most. He had opened his home to a stranger without hesitation, asking nothing in return. Harold had made grand promises in his letters, but Jake showed his kindness through actions rather than words. That afternoon, Margaret insisted on helping with the ranch work. She had grown up on a farm in Minnesota and wasn't afraid of hard work. Jake was initially reluctant, worried about her safety, but Margaret proved she could handle herself around animals and machinery. Emma was delighted to have another pair of hands, and together they tackled projects that had been waiting for attention. "You know," Emma said as they worked together mending a fence, "I haven't seen Dad this relaxed in years. He's always worried about everything, but having you here seems to have lightened his load somehow." Margaret felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name, not the desperate hope she had felt about Harold, but something warmer and more genuine. As the days passed, Margaret found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life. She helped Emma with the cooking and housework, assisted Jake with the animals, and gradually felt her confidence returning. The humiliation of being abandoned at the train station began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging she hadn't expected to find. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Jake broached a subject they had been dancing around. "Margaret, I hope you don't think I'm being presumptuous, but I've been thinking about your situation. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to, but I know you'll want to make some permanent plans eventually." Margaret nodded, having wrestled with the same thoughts. Her savings were nearly exhausted, and she couldn't impose on Jake's hospitality indefinitely. "I've been thinking too," she admitted. "I need to find work, maybe rent a small place in town. I can't keep taking advantage of your kindness." Jake was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at her. "What if I told you that you wouldn't be taking advantage? What if I told you that having you here has made both Emma and me happier than we've been in years?" Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "Jake, I don't want you to feel obligated." He held up a hand to stop her. "This isn't about obligation. It's about recognizing something good when it comes into your life. You fit here, Margaret. Emma adores you, and honestly, I've come to care about you more than I expected." His words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. "I care about you too," Margaret said softly. "Both of you, but I don't want to complicate things. I came here looking for one thing and found something completely different. I don't want to make assumptions about what this is or what it could become." Jake nodded, understanding her caution. "Then let's take it one day at a time," he said. "No pressure, no expectations. Just see what develops naturally." Over the following weeks, Margaret and Jake's relationship deepened gradually. They discovered shared interests in books, music, and old movies. Jake taught her to ride horses, and Margaret helped him with the ranch's bookkeeping. Emma thrived with another adult female in the house, and Margaret found herself stepping naturally into a maternal role she hadn't expected to want again. The breakthrough came when Margaret received a call from Deputy Martinez. They had arrested Harold Whitman and several associates in a multi-state fraud operation. Margaret's testimony had been crucial in building the case, and she would be needed to testify at the trial. "We estimate they bilked at least 30 women out of their savings," the deputy explained. "Your courage in coming forward has helped us shut down their entire operation." That night, Margaret felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Harold's betrayal had led her to Jake and Emma, and now her experience was helping protect other women from the same fate. She realized that everything had happened exactly as it was supposed to, leading her to where she truly belonged. Jake found her sitting on the porch steps, looking up at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her. Margaret turned to him, her heart full of gratitude and growing love. "I was thinking about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads to the best thing," she said. "If Harold hadn't abandoned me at that train station, I never would have met you and Emma." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jake admitted. "I wasn't looking for romance, Margaret. I was just trying to be a good neighbor. But somewhere along the way you became essential to my happiness." He paused, then took her hand in his. "I know it's soon, and I know this wasn't what either of us planned, but I love you. Not because you're convenient or because I need help around the ranch. I love you because you're kind and strong and you make my daughter laugh. You make me laugh too." Margaret felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "I love you too, Jake. I love the man you are, the father you are, the life you've built here. I love how you took in a stranger without asking for anything in return. I love how you've made me feel valuable and needed and cherished." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the vast desert sky sparkle with stars. The next morning, Emma found them in the kitchen making breakfast together, and she immediately sensed the change in their relationship. "It's about time," she said with a grin. "I was wondering when you two were going to figure out what was obvious to everyone else." Margaret laughed, pulling the girl into a hug. "Is this okay with you, sweetheart? I know this is your home, and I don't want to intrude." "Are you kidding?" Emma said. "You're the best thing that's happened to us. Dad's been happier these past few weeks than he's been since Mom died. And I finally have someone who understands what it's like to be the only woman in a house full of work boots and saddles." Margaret felt her heart overflow with love for this wise, generous girl who had welcomed her so completely. Over the following months, Margaret's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. She officially moved in with Jake and Emma, contributing her Social Security check to the household expenses and taking on more responsibilities around the ranch. She enrolled in an online bookkeeping course to better help with the business side of the operation, and she started a small garden that provided fresh vegetables for their table. The community gradually accepted Margaret as Jake's partner and Emma's surrogate mother. She joined the local women's club, volunteered at the library, and found herself more socially active than she had been in years. The isolation she had felt in Minneapolis, surrounded by the memories of her life with Robert, was replaced by a sense of belonging and purpose. When the trial of Harold Whitman and his associates began, Margaret traveled to Phoenix to testify. Jake accompanied her, providing moral support as she faced the man who had abandoned her at the train station. Harold looked older and smaller than she had imagined, and Margaret felt nothing but pity for him as she told her story to the court. "He promised me companionship and security," she testified. "He convinced me to spend my savings on a train ticket and to sell my possessions to start fresh. When I arrived at the station, trusting and hopeful, he wasn't there. He had never intended to meet me. He was just using me for whatever money he could get." The prosecutor presented evidence of similar schemes involving dozens of other women, many of whom had lost far more than Margaret. Harold was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Margaret was awarded restitution for her travel expenses and emotional distress. But the money meant little to her compared to the satisfaction of knowing that other women would be protected from his predatory behavior. As she left the courthouse, Jake took her hand and squeezed it gently. "You did good in there," he said. "You turned your pain into protection for others." That evening back at the ranch, Margaret sat on the porch with Jake and Emma, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I have something to tell you both," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "Today, facing Harold in court, I realized something. I used to think he had stolen something from me, my dignity, my trust, my savings. But I was wrong. He didn't steal anything. He led me to everything I was meant to have." Jake and Emma both looked at her with love and understanding. "You're part of this family now," Emma said firmly. "Not because of what happened to you, but because of who you are. You belong here with us." Margaret felt tears of gratitude and joy streaming down her face. At 60 years old, she had found her true home and the love she had never dared to hope for. 6 months later, on a crisp December morning, Margaret O'Brien became Margaret Morrison in a simple ceremony at the ranch. The local pastor officiated, and the entire community came to celebrate. Emma served as maid of honor, and Jake's best friend Tom stood as best man. Margaret wore a simple ivory dress and carried wildflowers from her garden, and she had never felt more beautiful or more loved. As they exchanged vows, Margaret looked into Jake's honest eyes and saw her future, not the comfortable retirement Harold had promised, but something far more precious. She saw love, partnership, adventure, and the joy of being truly known and accepted. She saw a man who had rescued her not because she was helpless, but because he recognized her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "I promise to love you not just in the good times, but in the difficult ones," Jake said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to support your dreams, to share your burdens, and to build a life with you that honors both our past and our future." Margaret felt her heart overflow with love and gratitude as she made her own vows, promising to be his partner in all things, to love Emma as her own daughter, and to build a life together based on trust, respect, and genuine affection. The reception was held in the ranch's main barn, decorated with string lights and wild flowers. The whole community came together to celebrate, bringing food, music, and joy. Margaret danced with Jake to their favorite song, surrounded by friends who had become family. She thought of Harold Whitman, sitting in his prison cell, and felt only gratitude for his betrayal that had led her to this moment. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Margaret stood on the porch of her new home, looking up at the star-filled sky. Jake joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Margaret leaned back against his chest, feeling completely at peace. "Only that I didn't get on that train sooner," she said. "Everything that happened brought me to you, to Emma, to this life. I wouldn't change a single thing." Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her bridesmaid dress but with bare feet. "Are you two getting mushy out here?" she asked with a grin. "Because I made hot chocolate and I'm not drinking it alone." Margaret laughed, pulling her new daughter into their embrace. "Come here, sweetheart. We're just appreciating how perfect this moment is." The three of them stood together, a family created not by blood but by choice, love, and the recognition that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances. Later that night, as Margaret unpacked her few remaining belongings in the master bedroom she now shared with Jake, she came across the letters Harold had written to her. She had kept them as evidence for the trial, but now she wasn't sure what to do with them. Jake found her sitting on the edge of the bed, holding the stack of papers. "What are those?" he asked, settling beside her. Margaret explained, and Jake took the letters, reading a few of the flowery promises Harold had made. "You know what strikes me about these," he said finally. "They're all about what he was going to give you, what he was going to do for you. But he never asked about who you were, what you wanted, what you had to offer. He saw you as a means to an end, not as a person." Margaret nodded, understanding the difference. "You've never tried to change me or make me into something I'm not," she said. "You've just loved me as I am." Jake smiled, taking her hand. "That's because you're perfect as you are. I didn't need to find someone to take care of, I needed to find someone to share my life with. There's a big difference." They burned the letters in the fireplace that night, watching Harold's false promises turn to ash. Margaret felt the last of her old life disappearing, making room for the new chapter she was writing with Jake and Emma. As the flames died down, Jake pulled her close. "No more looking back," he said. "From now on, we only look forward." Margaret agreed, feeling lighter and freer than she had in years. The first year of their marriage brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The ranch required constant work, and there were times when money was tight. But Margaret found that working alongside Jake and Emma, building something together, was far more satisfying than the passive retirement she had imagined with Harold. She discovered strengths she didn't know she had, and found purpose in the daily rhythm of ranch life. Emma thrived with Margaret's guidance, growing more confident and mature. She began applying to veterinary schools, and Margaret helped her with applications and essays. "I couldn't have done this without you," Emma told her one evening as they worked on her personal statement. "You've shown me what it means to be a strong woman, to survive disappointment and find happiness anyway." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the girl's words. "You were already strong, sweetheart. You just needed someone to remind you of it." As Emma prepared to leave for college, Margaret realized that her role in the girl's life had been temporary but crucial. She had helped Emma transition from childhood to adulthood, providing the feminine guidance and support she had been missing. On Emma's 18th birthday, Margaret presented her with a special gift, a leather-bound journal with Emma's initials embossed on the cover. "I want you to write your story," Margaret said. "All of it, the good parts and the difficult parts. Your mother's death, your father's struggle, my arrival, our life together. Someday, when you're older, you'll want to remember these days exactly as they were." Emma hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You've been more than a stepmother to me," she whispered. "You've been my friend, my mentor, my example of what a woman can be. I'm going to miss you so much when I leave for college." Margaret held her close, her heart full of love and pride. I'm going to miss you too, but I'm so proud of the woman you've become. You're going to do amazing things. As Emma's departure for college approached, Margaret and Jake began to contemplate their future as empty nesters. They had built their relationship around family life, and both wondered how they would adjust to being alone together. But Margaret found herself looking forward to this new phase, eager to focus on her marriage and explore the dreams she had set aside. "I've been thinking about something," Margaret said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "What if we expanded the ranch? Maybe added some guest facilities for people who want to experience ranch life. I think there's a market for that kind of thing." Jake looked intrigued. "Like a dude ranch?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Something like that. I have some ideas about how we could make it work." Jake smiled, recognizing the entrepreneurial spirit that had drawn him to Margaret in the first place. "I love it when you get that look in your eyes," he said. "Tell me more." Margaret outlined her vision for converting part of the ranch into a guest operation, offering horseback riding, ranch work experiences, and home-cooked meals. It would provide additional income while allowing them to share their lifestyle with others. "We could call it Second Chances Ranch," Margaret suggested, "for people who are looking for a fresh start like I was." Jake loved the idea, and they spent the next several months researching and planning. Margaret used her bookkeeping skills to develop a business plan, and Jake focused on the practical aspects of expanding their facilities. The project gave them a shared goal and brought them even closer together. They worked side by side, planning and building, dreaming and creating. Margaret discovered that she had a talent for hospitality and marketing, while Jake excelled at the construction and operational aspects of the business. Their different skills complemented each other perfectly, and they found themselves falling deeper in love as they worked toward their common vision. When Emma left for college, Margaret felt the expected sadness, but it was tempered by excitement about the future. She and Jake had built something special together, and now they had the chance to take it to the next level. Their first guests arrived in the spring, a family from Chicago looking for an authentic Western experience. Margaret and Jake were nervous but excited as they welcomed them to Second Chances Ranch. The guests were enchanted by the experience. They loved the home-cooked meals, the horseback riding, and the opportunity to participate in real ranch work. Margaret found herself in her element, sharing stories and creating memories for people who needed a break from their everyday lives. Jake was a natural teacher, patient and skilled at introducing city folks to ranch life. Word spread quickly, and soon they had bookings months in advance. Margaret developed a reputation for creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere that made guests feel like family. She shared her own story when appropriate, inspiring others who were facing their own second chances. Many guests wrote to thank her, saying that their time at the ranch had given them the courage to make positive changes in their own lives. One particularly memorable guest was a woman named Patricia, who had recently divorced after 30 years of marriage. She arrived at the ranch broken and uncertain, much as Margaret had been when she first met Jake. Over the course of her week-long stay, Patricia rediscovered her strength and independence. She learned to ride horses, helped with the ranch work, and spent hours talking with Margaret about rebuilding her life. "You've shown me that it's never too late to start over," Patricia said on her last day. "I came here feeling like my life was over, but I'm leaving with hope." Margaret hugged her, remembering her own journey from despair to joy. "The best part of a second chance is that you get to choose how to use it," she told Patricia. "Make it count." As the ranch business grew, Margaret and Jake found themselves busier than ever, but also more fulfilled. They had created something meaningful together, providing not just a vacation destination but a place of healing and renewal. Margaret often thought about Harold Whitman and felt grateful for his betrayal. Without it, she never would have found her true calling or experienced the deep love she shared with Jake. Emma came home for holidays and summers, bringing friends and boyfriends to meet her family. She was thriving in college, studying veterinary medicine, and planning to return to the ranch after graduation. "I want to add a veterinary clinic to the ranch," she told Margaret and Jake during one visit. "We could offer services to the local community and also take care of our own animals and the horses our guests ride." Margaret was delighted with Emma's plan, seeing it as another way to expand their mission of helping others. "We could call it the Emma Morrison Veterinary Clinic," she suggested. Emma blushed but looked pleased. "I like that," she said. "It sounds official and important." Jake beamed with pride at his daughter's ambition and at Margaret's support of Emma's dreams. The ranch continued to grow and evolve, but Margaret never forgot the lessons she had learned from her own second chance. She made sure that every guest felt valued and welcomed, just as Jake had made her feel when she was stranded and alone. She shared her story when it was appropriate, always emphasizing that setbacks and disappointments could lead to unexpected blessings. One evening, as Margaret and Jake sat on their porch watching another spectacular sunset, she reflected on how much her life had changed. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Harold had shown up that day?" she asked. Jake considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but I can't imagine it working out well. He wasn't the right man for you, Margaret. You deserved better than his empty promises." Margaret nodded, understanding the truth of his words. "I thought I wanted security and comfort," she said, "but what I really needed was love and purpose. Harold could never have given me that, even if he had been sincere." Jake took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I'm glad you found both here," he said. "I'm glad we found each other." As they sat in comfortable silence, Margaret marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started out as a lonely widow looking for companionship and had ended up as a wife, mother, and successful businesswoman. She had found love, purpose, and a community that valued her contributions. Most importantly, she had learned that second chances were not just about finding new opportunities, but about recognizing the strength and resilience that had been inside her all along. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Margaret made a silent wish for all the women who might be sitting at train stations or in lonely apartments, hopping for their own second chances. She wished for them the courage to take risks, the wisdom to recognize true kindness, and the faith to believe that their best days might still be ahead of them. Jake squeezed her hand gently, and Margaret knew that her wish was already being answered. Through their ranch, through their story, and through the example of their love, they were helping others find their own second chances. Harold Whitman had abandoned her at a train station, but he had unknowingly led her to something far more valuable than he could ever have offered, a life of love, purpose, and endless possibility. As they headed inside for the night, Margaret took one last look at the vast desert sky and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new guests, new challenges, and new opportunities to make a difference. She was ready for all of it, confident in the knowledge that she had found her place in the world and the love of her life. At 61 years old, Margaret Morrison was just getting started on the greatest adventure of her life.